So Icahn emerged the unlikely hero. "We got ourselves an airline." The New York Times reported he shouted, donning a pilot's jacket and dancing around his ICE, when he heard that the TWA board had decided in his favor. The union representatives and their advisors were jubilant, too. Despite the fact that their deal with Icahn prohibited him from giving Lorenzo a standstill, promising to buy no more stock, they had always been fearful that the wily investor was merely toying with them, intent on using their concessions to get a higher price from Lorenzo. There was certainly an economic rationale for what Icahn had done. Initially, before all the union drama, he had been a willing buyer of the airline at $18 a share, or about $600 million. When Lorenzo offered $23, Icahn had been a seller, except that Lorenzo had balked at the extra $16 million, which had killed the deal. With the $300 million of union concessions in hand, Icahn became a buyer at $24. And he stuck at $24, even though Lorenzo came in at $26, and even though the unions and the TWA advisors begged him to go to $25 in order to make the directors' decision to side with him a little easier. In Icahn's judgment, he didn't have to give that extra dollar, and, true to form, he cut the price to the hair's breadth. But there was more than economics at work here. By mid-1985, Icahn was carving out for himself a public image far grander than the one he had had for years as a hard-nosed green mailer. Some who know him well agree that Icahn's decision to buy TWA was influenced by more than the numbers, which heretofore had been his only touchstone. Carl got as much of a kick out of being a savior to the unions, a champion of labor, as he did out of owning an airline, maybe more, Black said. Because it was a nice counterpunch to all the things he'd been being accused of in Washington. He did care about his image. And don't forget, it would have potential, too, for whatever he would want to do in the future. In early September, '85, Icahn chose Paine-Webber to raise $750 million for his buyout of TWA. Lorenzo, typically, had made a deal for Icahn's purchase of his stock, then unmade it, and then rampaged around for another week or so before finally settling. The explanation offered by both Drexel and Icahn for Icahn's choice of Paine-Webber is that in early September Drexel could not obtain a release from Lorenzo, whom they were still representing. However, one advisor in the deal said that he told Icahn that he thought he could obtain a release from Lorenzo for Drexel, and that Icahn said not to bother. Steiner's opinion was that Carl chose Paine-Webber because they offered to do the deal for a quarter or a half point less than Drexel would have charged. It no doubt suited Icahn too, because it enabled him to be independent of Drexel in a junk bond financing and have a good excuse for it, so that it would not jeopardize his dealings with Milken. Joseph Stewart, the Paine-Webber investment banker who approached Icahn, thinks he got the deal because he offered to do it for less than Drexel. Robert Peiser, then TWA's chief financial officer, said, "Carl doesn't want to say that he went to Paine-Webber because they were cheaper. But he is a great believer in getting service the cheapest he can, and forget the quality." This was an unusually large junk deal for Paine-Webber. But the head of its junk bond department was David Brown, who had been one of Milken's early hires back in the '70s. In 1984, Brown became the FIRST of Milken's followers, who was said to have challenged Milken for a greater share of Professor ITS and then to have left with acrimony. At least in theory, Brown knew the Milken network and could distribute it. Icahn, of course, is no one's fool. In an apparently unprecedented arrangement, and the terms were to be kept secret, Paine-Webber placed $1 million in escrow, to be forfeited if they were unable to do the deal on the agreed-upon terms. The way the deal was structured, the $750 million would enable Icahn to buy out all the shareholders and also take out his investment of about $300 million in TWA stock. In addition to getting all his money out, he planned to take out TWA's computerized reservation system, PARS. It would be given to the Icahn Group as a dividend, and Icahn planned to lease PARS back to TWA for 10 years for an amount that would have given Icahn an annual professor IT of $25 million. Under this plan, Icahn would have had little more than his pride at risk. He would have recouped his $300 million, he would own the lucrative PARS. And in the worst of all worlds, if the airline went bust, it would be the bondholders, not Icahn, who would lose. The investment bankers and bond salesmen at Paine Webber wanted to feature Icahn at their roadshows. But since Icahn wanted to travel as little as possible, they staged an enormous roadshow at the Waldorf. In a rare move for an underwriter, Paine Webber paid for prospective buyers to fly in from as far away as California and Japan. According to Joseph Adams, who would later work on the Icahn offering at Drexel, it was a mistake to feature Icahn. You use the operating guy, that's whom the debt holders want to hear from. And you keep it to relatively small groups. Otherwise, if one person has a valid concern and stands up and voices it, all of a sudden 200 FTY people who never would have thought of it are worried. That wasn't a roadshow, it was a media event, Adams scoffed. Icahn at the Waldorf. Worse, it did not sell. Icahn, apparently carried away by his enthusiasm for PARS, went on at such length about its value that the prospective bond buyers began to wonder why PARS, as well as all Icahn's money, had to come out of the company. In October, Stewart told Icahn that he had placed about $660 million of the $750 million of debt, but in order to place the rest PARS would have to be left in TWA. Steiner says that Paine Webber asked him to place some of the junk bonds in Europe, and he asked Icahn whether he should. Carl said, "They are not going to get the deal done. It is a waste of time. Forget it," Steiner recalled. Now Black returned to the scene, telling Icahn that Milken not only would raise the $750 million with PARS out of the company, but would raise another $500 million war chest, or blind pool, in the company in which PARS would be placed. Bond buyers who liked the airline could buy its debt. Those who were enamored of PARS could buy that company's debt. Others could mix the two. The company that would be formed to receive PARS, and the $500 million, would be called Mandrake, as in The Magician. About Paine Webber's failure, Mark Schenkman of Schenkman Capital Management, Inc., one of Milken's early converts to the junk fold, said, "They just didn't have the placement power to do it. David Brown could know the right names and know those people, but you've got to really have their conference idents to come in for such a super high-risk deal. He doesn't have the relationships Mike does. He can't call the Beltzbergs, Perelman and the rest and basically call in a chit." Many in the junk market suggested that Paine Webber's difficulty was exacerbated by Milken's and his crew's bad-mouthing and sabotaging. It was, they say, Milken's public humiliation of his former acolyte, Brown, for having dared to compete. Others had left Milken, but they had generally gone with his assistants to spots where they were, if anything, more useful to him than when they worked for him. The humiliation was not Paine Webber's only loss. Icahn took the $1 million that the firm had placed in escrow. They, bankers at Paine Webber, never believed Carl would take the million, said Adams. When he did, they were just shocked. But Carl said, "Hey, that was the deal." Paine Webber did win its Phi GHT to stay in the deal and be listed as a co-manager. But, as was nearly always the case when another firm tried to co-manage a deal with Milken's crew, it was co-manager in name only, and it received a pittance compared to Drexel. During November and December, the numbers at TWA deteriorated rapidly. In November, TWA revised the forecast of its losses for the year from $70 million to $110 million. In early December, the night before Milken was to unleash his sales force to sell this deal, TWA got a reading on its November results, which indicated that losses for the year were going to be $150 million. Milken called off his troops. Icon's agreement with TWA gave him two outs: if the airline suffered a material adverse change, or if he could not arrange financing. Both were available to him. Either he was going to change the terms of his deal, paying less cash and more paper, or he would terminate it and sell his position. But who would take him out? The only buyer whose interest in TWA appeared undying was Lorenzo. The unions were violently opposed to Icon selling out to Lorenzo. One advisor in the deal said Icon told him that he was dying to sell out to Lorenzo, except that he was afraid the machinists would kidnap his children. Publicly, however, Icon declared that he felt he had a moral commitment to the unions not to sell to Lorenzo. Then, on December 20, came the terrorist bombings in the airports in Rome and Vienna, which killed several people at TWA ticket counters. Picer, the TWA chief financial officer, said the bombings really shook Carl. We had a long conversation about how we could stop the terrorism. We concluded, of course, that we couldn't. It really shook him, that there were these events outside of even his control that affected the company. He realized he was not in control of terrorists in Rome. He wanted out, Picer said. We talked about management's buying him out, and he was interested in that. But we couldn't keep the labor concessions, and we didn't have a lot of time to raise the money. If we could have come up with a proposal to take him out whole, I'm sure he would have taken it then. Icon was trapped. His investors too were losing money. He had bought TWA stock at an average price of about $19, and the stock was trading at about $16. He decided to pass up the leveraged buyout. He already had control of the company. He negotiated a new deal with TWA, whereby minority shareholders would have an option to exchange part of their shares for preferred stock. And Drexel said that it would raise $750 million for the deal, with the magical $500 million for Mandrake a thing of the past, but that Icon could not get more than $100 million of his money out. He decided to leave in the company the $750 million that Drexel was raising. And Pars as well. An indication of the extent to which Icon may have felt beholden to Drexel at this point is that he committed $200 million to GAF's bid for Union Carbide, for which Milken was raising $5 billion. Since GAF later dropped its bid, Icon walked away with a healthy commitment fee. According to Icon, this is the only Drexel megadeal for which he signed up. The TWA deal changed one last time when Drexel raised the money, not $750 million but $660 million. The reason Drexel gave for coming up short, in the face of a highly conference ident letter it had given, was that conditions at TWA were so disastrous by early February that many expected the company to go bankrupt. The list of bondholders submitted to the SEC months later, when the time came for these privately placed bonds to be registered, is not a typical Drexel megadeal list. The most substantial pieces were taken by Fred Carr, adding all his companies together, $72,500,000, and Tom Spiegel, through Liberty Service Corporation, a subsidiary of Columbia S&L, $64,825,000. Ron Perelman, through Revlon, Inc., bought $38,175,000. There were a few other tranches of $30 million and $20 million, but the rest was composed of relatively small purchases. Some buyers came in for as little as $75,000 and quite a few between $100,000 and $500,000. There were executives from Columbia Savings and Loan, a teachers' retirement association, an investment from Middlebury College. One of Milken's protégés, Dort Cameron, is a Middlebury graduate and invests money for the college. The list looks as though it was something of a struggle to create. And that, indeed, was what Icahn told TWA when he announced that Drexel was having so much trouble that they could raise only $660 million, not $750 million, and that therefore he wanted to exercise his option to change the terms one more time. He now wanted to lessen the dividend on the preferred that he was offering to minority shareholders. Freund, TWA's advisor, called Fred Joseph to ask whether the company was being jerked around, or whether there really was trouble. Fred called me back and said we weren't being jerked around, Freund recalled. A source at Drexel maintained, however, that while raising the $750 million was indeed difficult, it was by no means impossible. Michael would just have had to make a couple of calls. But, according to this source, Icahn asked that Drexel claim it was impossible to raise the $750 million, so that he could then have an excuse to change the terms of his deal with TWA. Icahn denies this allegation. By the time Drexel held its annual Predators Ball in the FIRST week of April 1986, the TWA financing was completed and the terms of Icahn's acquisition of the airline were, finally, FLUID no longer. But events had continued their downward spiral. Just 3 weeks earlier, the FLID attendants had started a long-threatened strike. While Icahn had prepared for it, training 1,500 new hires, the strike had caused enormous disruption and loss of revenue in its FIRST few weeks. The FLID attendants were at the Drexel conference, parading with their picket signs around the Beverly Hills Hotel, where so many of the most favored guests, including Icahn, were staying. On the evening of the FIRST day they took up their post outside Don Engel's famous Bungalow 8, where a cocktail party for the big hitters was being held, and then followed these guests to Chasen's, the swank Beverly Hills restaurant which hosts a gala dinner at the Predators Ball each year. By midnight, however, a few of the FLID attendants had put aside their signs and joined the Drexel merrymakers at Engel's table in the Polo Lounge. Fred McCarthy, Nelson Peltz's main investment banker at Drexel, remembered, "I said, when we were at Chasen's, what a waste of good-looking women. Why don't we bring them in here?" Icahn was not in the Polo Lounge. He had arrived at the conference earlier in the day, and then came a news broadcast that a terrorist bomb had exploded aboard a TWA fluid from Rome to Athens. Icahn turned and headed back to New York. He may well have been remembering his visit to the Predators Ball 1 year before. Then, he had had no major company to run. Then, he had had his money and no situation that he could not control. Then, he had been fresh from his Phillips Grand Slam, where he had played his game and made $52.50 million in 10 weeks. And then, he had stopped in at Picer's presentation. By October 1986, 6 months after Icahn had departed hastily from the Predators Ball, he had subdued, at least for the short term, his demons at TWA. The staggering losses of the FIRST half of the year, $275.60 million, had been staunched. TWA reported third-quarter earnings of $65.20 million, which looked remarkable not only in comparison to the FIRST 2 quarters, but to the same period 1 year earlier, when the airline suffered a loss of $13.50 million. And TWA's operating earnings for 1987, $240 million, would be the best in the airline's history. The second best was $95 million in 1965. There were several factors in the turnaround, and a couple of them, as had been true from the start, were beyond Icon's control. But now they were going with him instead of against him. Terrorism had subsided. Therefore, by the late summer of '86, transatlantic travel was just beginning to return to normal levels. And the price of oil went down, enabling TWA to cut its annual fuel bill by $100 million. Other factors, however, were Icon rot. He had taken on the flight attendants, replacing them with newly trained hires, so that while the strike was disruptive, the airline was not brought to a halt. The new hires who replaced the veteran workers started at $12,000 a year and abided by tough new work rules. If the flight attendants union succeeds in its ongoing court battle with Icon, the airline could be liable for over $400 million in back pay, and it could also be forced to reinstate the former flight attendants. But, for the moment, Icon was the victor in that contest, and he claimed savings of $120 million a year. He had negotiated the sale of a half-interest in TWA's PARS reservation system to Northwest Airlines, giving the airline an infusion of about $200 million. And he had negotiated the $242 million acquisition by TWA of Ozark Airlines, an acquisition that the previous management of TWA had been trying, unsuccessfully, to effect for some time. Ozark had been TWA's principal domestic competitor in vying for TRAF IC to end from St. Louis. Now TWA would control over 80% of that TRAF IC, giving a large boost to its domestic professorability. The acquisition of Ozark was an important move to expand and strengthen TWA, but by far the most dramatic results Icon achieved sprang from his cost-cutting. He had won the early concessions from the pilots and the machinists. He had eliminated layers of bureaucracy at TWA. He had taken on the flight attendant strike. He had decided not to renew leases for some planes. Thanks to the drop in oil prices and Icon's talent for chiseling, TWA would see a savings of $600 million for the year. The praise on Wall Street was not universal. In the view of some analysts, Icon was running TWA like a classic short-term play, making moves that would translate into quick professor ITS with no long-range perspective. He was not investing in new aircraft, and TWA's fluid EET was aged. Morale at the company was terrible, with some employees leaving because they were convinced Icon was only waiting for the opportunity to sell it. Still, TWA was now Professor I-table, making an operating Professor ITS about $250,000 a day. It was hard to argue with success. And with the corner turned at TWA, Icon emerged in early October with his most audacious bid since the one he had made for Phillips Petroleum, an $8 billion tender offer for all shares of the Mammoth USX, the nation's largest steel producer and a force in the energy business, with about $21 billion in assets. With about $650 million from his usual investor partnerships in TWA, which contributed about one-third, Icon had begun buying USX stock in June and now owned 11.4% of the company. And Drexel said it was highly confident that it could raise $7 billion. Icon's absorption in TWA had not been complete. He had found time and energy in the spring of 1986 to amass a large stake in Viacom International, the broadcasting, cable television and entertainment concern, and to negotiate with that company's management a thinly disguised greenmail package which afforded him and his major investor, Jeffrey Steiner, a Professor IT of about $100 million. But that had been the old green mailer Icon, just keeping his hand in, turning a Professor IT. As a major Drexel player, one of those few with appetites and ambition gigantic enough to be, as Meshulam Riklis had put it, Milken's monsters, Icahn had been sidelined ever since he took over TWA. For a time, it had seemed that he might be the Phi Rst of Drexel's kingpins to topple. But he had prevailed, and now he was back with an appetite as insatiable as ever. Icahn's triumph, of course, was also Drexel's. It meant that they had chosen wisely when they decided to give him a war chest, back in 1984. Nothing Icahn had done, up until that point, proved that Icahn would be able to run a large company. He was running ACF successfully, but that was different. As Black pointed out, Carl saw the value in ACF. There were a few things that obfuscated its value to the rest of the public. It had a few non-performing dogs, which it turned out you could sell for real money. And then there was the railcar leasing company, which was a gem, a cash cow. So Carl sold off the dogs, and was left with a stable cash cow. Indeed, the takeover of ACF cost Icahn $410 million. But he then raised $400 million by selling off pieces. But ACF is not a complicated business, Black said. Frankly, it was not until TWA that we saw Carl's managerial talents. With TWA, Icahn became living proof of the Raiders' catechism that he, and Milken too, had been reciting for years. The fall of '86 was the season of Drexel's triumph, when the business press crowned Milken as the financier of the age, and his Raiders as industrialists. Icahn was one of the new celebrities. In October, Businessweek published his "I Told You So" essay entitled, "What Ails America, and What Should Be Done?" There Icahn delivered a homily. America has lost its edge to foreign competition, in some large measure, because of bad management, he wrote. When America established its economic leadership in the world, its industrial powerhouses had been owned by the Carnegies, the Mellons and the Morgans, to whom managements answered. With the passing of these owners and the dispersion of stock ownership among the public, management answered to no one. It became autocratic and mediocre. It encouraged bureaucracy. But now, declared Icahn, pointing with a flourish to what he had done at ACF and TWA, the manager-owner was back. In press interviews in which Icahn recently had been challenged about whether he really wanted USX or whether the savvy fast buck artist was just up to his old tricks, he had pointed to TWA. Skeptics had said the same thing then, he countered, but he did buy TWA, he had spent time running it, and the company now was Professor I-Table. Now, he told Businessweek, I really want USX. Putting it together with TWA. Now that is really going to be something. Now if we can turn around a couple of these companies and make them more productive, that will make a statement about what I've been saying. Economic historians will see that I was proven correct. Among the Drexel-made titans in the fall of 1986, Icahn was the one who most craved stature, the only one who made statements about public policy. Nelson Peltz was interested in expanding his empire and enjoying a life of rarefied luxury. Ronald Perelman was interested in expanding his empire and climbing the social ladder. Icahn, clearly, was bent on empire expansion, but he also seemed to be ruminating about posterity. He spoke of writing his autobiography. He did in fact have more intellectual depth, and a greater range of business talents, than his Drexel-crowned peers. That was why he did not have to enough lect before Milken. The more respect he earned, and the more he publicly articulated the Drexel credo, which was also his own, the more valuable and adjunct-free though he became. Jeffrey Steiner said, Carl and Mike have a very good relationship. Mike feels, I think, that Carl is different from most Drexel clients, and he is. I don't think that Carl has ever felt as dependent upon Drexel as so many others have. In the offices of Icahn and Company in Midtown Manhattan, Elliot Schnall was marveling at the fact that after the marathon of TWA his nephew had not even paused for a breather before plunging headlong into USX. Schnall says that he had counseled Icahn, during the TWA takeover battle, to sell out to Lorenzo and take his Professor ITS. Sometime during Icahn's travails of the past 8 months, he had told Schnall that he wished he had taken that advice. So he had weathered that crisis, only to go into the steel industry. Schnall has invested in nearly every one of Icahn's deals, but when Icahn asked him whether he wanted to join the investment partnership for USX, he declined. Schnall has done well with Icahn. In 1985, he made over $1 million. But he laments still that he accepted Icahn's suggestion that Icahn buy out his 20% interest in the company, back in 1974. He calculates and then recalculates what would have been his. In October 1986, Schnall fired Icahn's net Professor ITS at about $300 million and so concluded that $60 million, pre-tax, would have been his. He and Icahn are close. When Schnall is in Manhattan, mainly in the spring and fall, he comes to Icahn and company nearly every day. He and Icahn banter about Schnall's fateful error. Schnall laughs, but he has never stopped wondering whether Icahn back in '74 had some sense of the bonanza that was coming, and wanted it all. Kingsley, whose small warren of an off-ICE is shouting distance from Icahn's, has no such lost partnership interests to regret. He has remained an employee all these years, which sometimes bothers him and sometimes does not. He says he has moderate needs, which his salary and occasional bonuses satisfy, like college tuition for his children, a car for his son. He still lives in Forest Hills, Queens, as he did when he started working for Icahn, though he has moved from an apartment to a comfortable home, and that suits him. "What do I want, to join the jet setters?" asks Kingsley, although he wouldn't mind having a summer house. Kingsley's off-ICE is a reminder that while he might have made more of a name for himself and more money on Wall Street if he had left Icahn's shadow, at Icahn and Company he has been free to be himself. Stacks of the Financial Times, waiting to be clipped, climb halfway to the ceiling on one side of the room. The window behind Kingsley's desk is nearly obscured by mountains of 10 kiloseconds, annual reports, prospectuses. And Kingsley himself is barely discernible behind the cascading piles of papers that rise from his desk. "Mount Everest," remarked a secretary as she tossed a letter onto the top. From beneath his desk, on his visitor's side, papers spill. And there, too, rest unpacked cartons from the peregrinations of Icahn and Company over the past 2 decades, one from 42 Broadway, one from 25 Broadway. Out of this strange, unsightly chaos has come what Kingsley says with some pride is the overwhelming majority of Icahn's targets. He selects, then he proposes, debates, sometimes is rejected by Icahn. But they have been together for 20 years, and he has a good sense of what will persuade. When Kingsley was arguing for USX, where Chairman David Roderick and the steelworkers union had been at each other's throats, he said, "You know, Carl, you could do again with the unions what you did in TWA." And he is more than Icahn's analyst. Once Icahn is in the midst of a deal, Kingsley is his constant sounding board, really his co-strategist, and they often attend negotiating sessions together. They are an odd couple, segueing into well-worn routines on cue the way people who have been together for a long time often do. Icahn, who refers to himself as the Lone Ranger, calls Kingsley Tonto, and Kingsley obligingly plays the role. A cough from someone in an elevator sends them into a routine of eye-rolling, hypochondriac panic. One longtime friend of the two said, "Carl and Al operate in a kind of mutual hysteria." Kingsley fans, and there are quite a few in the circle of Icahn investors, suggested that Kingsley is the phantom of the operation, the moving finger that picks the right targets, while Icon is the front man, with the force of personality and presence to play the game. Al has always been the perfect foil for Carl, said one. Carl gets all the money and all the publicity, and Al gets to work at what he loves. Whatever are the dynamics of the relationship, it has endured. Among those employees who have aspired over the years to play significant roles at Icon and Company, Kingsley is the sole survivor. One former employee asserts that Icon has been as ruthless with employees as with the companies he targeted, guided by nothing but his economic benefit. Some employees, therefore, were useful for a time, until they demanded promotions or raises and thus outlived their usefulness. He is a keen valuer of assets, and that's how he judges people too. How Professor I table you're to him, said this former staffer. It's somewhat cold. He gets the maximum use out of people, and gives the minimum in return. Interviewed at his seigneurial estate, purchased from the actress Jennifer O'Neill and named Fox Field, after the Marshall Field raid, in Bedford, New York, Icon seemed finally to have made the adjustment to wealth. For years after he made millions, he had continued to live as he always had, taking the subway on occasion, eating lunch with Kingsley at a dive called The Dungeon, keeping a spare one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. But he has finally forsaken the subway and abandoned the dives, and he has purchased a penthouse apartment in the posh museum tower, next to the Museum of Modern Art. He has also become philanthropic. He has donated $500,000 to the renovation of Carnegie Hall and funded a center for abused children and the construction of housing for homeless families. In at least one instance, however, an Icon gift came with strings attached. In 1986 or so, Icon was discussing making a large donation to his alma mater, Princeton University, but he wanted to become a member of its board of trustees. When his request was rejected, the gift failed to materialize. By 1988, however, Icon discussions with Princeton about a possible donation were said by one close to Icon to be in progress, again. Icon's indulgence in luxury and his forays into philanthropy suggest that his longtime tight steadiness may be loosening. Certain habits, however, never die. When Icon, carrying a briefcase, and his uncle, Schnall, carrying an umbrella, go to a restaurant together, Schnall takes Icon's briefcase so that they don't have to leave more than one tip for the checkroom attendant. Now he shows a visitor the gardens he has been designing, explaining that it has recently become a hobby. He owns horses with Peter Brandt, the polo impresario, in nearby Greenwich, and he has attended the polo matches there. He tells a funny story about having seen Nelson Peltz, his Bedford neighbor, at a polo match. What with Icon, Peltz and Ivan Boesky, whose mansion is down the road from Icon's, Bedford, a longtime WASP enclave, is not what it used to be. I told Nelson, Icon says of Peltz, he's Bedford Hills' answer to Beverly Hills. While Icon now seems to be enjoying the pleasures and pastimes of the extraordinarily rich, he has no pretensions. He allows, with some self-amusement, that designing elegant gardens is a recent, not a long-time, hobby, and having found himself at those polo matches seems to amuse him, too. His closest friend is Stanley Nortman, who used to have a metals business in Great Neck, Long Island, and now is exploring some way for Icon and him to get into the movie business. Nortman is a singularly down-to-earth, unaffected individual, who seems closer in style to Bayswater than to Fox Field. And when Icon's wife, Libba, decided to give a black tie party at Fox Field for his 50th birthday, with a guest list that read like the Forbes rich list, Icon insisted that all the employees from Icon and Company be invited, too, and changed it to optional black tie. Icon sets off on his canned diatribe about incompetent management in America. It is for him an oft-repeated spiel about how most of the people running corporate America are former fraternity presidents who got where they are because everybody liked them. About how mediocrity rises naturally to the top because the number one guy, none too swift, wants someone unthreatening as number two. About how most of these CEOs are aristocrats who live for nothing but the perks of the office. One of Icon's favorite lines, now years old, is that whenever he tried to get one of these chief executive officers on the phone, the CEO's secretary would say he was out of pocket. He always wondered, where do they go when they're out of pocket? The only way he could get these guys off the golf course, Icon would conclude, was by filing a 13D. Another story, also well-worn, concerns his taking over ACF, which had operations in the Midwest and a headquarters staff of 173 in New York. He couldn't figure out what they were doing in New York, so he went to the guys in the Midwest and asked them, "How many of these guys in New York do you need to support you?" And they said, "None, we'd do better without them." But, not to be too hasty, Icon called in a consultant to analyze the New York operation. 6 weeks later the consultant returned with a big black book filled with charts. Icon said, "Don't give me that, just tell me, what do these guys do?" And the guy looked at him and he looked at the guy. And then Icon took out a check and said, "Here, I'm paying you no matter what you tell me. Now tell me, what the hell do they do?" At which point the consultant said, "Mr. Icon, you've been straight with me, so I'm going to be straight with you. We can't figure out what they do, either." So Icon closed the New York office. And Icon asserts that ACF was well run compared to TWA. At TWA he eventually replaced most of top management. Now he is full of steam. "What I've been saying all these years," declares Icon, referring to his polemics on the ills of American corporate management, "I never knew how true it was." He listens to his words for a moment, as though hearing them played back, and then laughs at the admission. These days, Icon can afford such moments of candor. His most strident critics, who for years derided him as the critic of management who had never managed much of anything, have been stilled by the TWA turnaround. And TWA is news, while the effects of some of the previous forays of this self-proclaimed savior of American business are not. Phillips Petroleum, for example, borrowed $4.50 billion in 1985 to repel Icon, swelling its debt load to $8.60 billion. The company had to cut $400 million from capital expenses, slash exploration budgets, sell $2 billion in assets and cut its dividends. Its workforce fell from 27,000 to 22,000 by the fall of 1986. Icon is well aware that he can hold TWA up before his critics like the cross before the vampire, and he does so. He continually trumpets himself as the savior of TWA, insisting that but for his intercession the company would have gone bankrupt. But the triumph, sweet as it is somewhat tinny. "Yeah," he says, "I know, this has stopped the critics. But this was almost easy. I mean, you need entrepreneurial spirit, and you need strength of personality, okay. But after that, it's sort of self-evident what has to be done. I mean, it's almost just common sense. The arbitrage with the options, I think, needed more brainpower." The measure of success that for Icon has always been the most compelling is dollars. Friends say that while he has clearly begun to think about his place in history, one said that Icon sees himself as heir to the merchant banking tradition of the Rothschilds and Samuel Montague. His drive for dollars appears unabated. And the two preoccupations are hardly in conference lict. The more successful he is as the manager-owner of once floundering companies, the more money he will make. As one longtime associate said, for Carl, it's his report card. Every week, every month, every year. Another friend recounted that he had recently remarked to Icon, "You know, Carl, before too long you're going to be worth $1 billion. What will you do, if you're not happy then?" And Carl said, "I will know I made a big mistake," his friend recalls. "It will mean I picked too low a number." 9. Pantry Pride Revlon. The crucial campaign. In the early evening of June 14, 1985, Ronald Perelman appeared at the lavish penthouse apartment of Michel Bergerac. Perelman had just acquired control of Pantry Pride, Inc., a supermarket chain discharged from Chapter 11 bankruptcy reorganization in 1981, which had assets of $407 million and a net worth of about $145 million. Bergerac was the chairman and chief executive officer of Revlon Inc., the cosmetics and healthcare giant, which as of December 1984 had over $2.30 billion in assets and net worth in excess of $1 billion. Implausible as it would have been in any era other than this one so dominated by Milken the magician, the small-time, unimpressive Perelman, transfigured by a wave of Milken's wand, had come courting. The chemistry, however, was all wrong. According to Bergerac, Perelman told him about McAndrews and Forbes Holdings, the mini-conglomerate he had amassed in the preceding 8 years with interests including cigars, chocolates, licorice extract and Phi LM processing. "I'd never heard of it," Bergerac said. Perelman talked enthusiastically about Pantry Pride and its most alluring asset, a huge tax loss carry-forward of over $300 million that could be used to shelter income. The company, which Perelman was in the process of stripping into a corporate shell, was his planned vehicle for acquiring Revlon. He was about to go on a Drexel roadshow, traveling to cities around the country, making his pitch to junk bond buyers, in order to raise about $350 million. "He told me that the dream of his life was to buy Revlon," recalled Bergerac. "I said that that was wonderful, but it was not for sale. He said that he would bid in the low 40s. He said that he would do wonderful things for me. I said that I didn't have much taste for being bribed, and goodbye." Perelman had offered "wonderful things," personal inducements, in addition to assuring Bergerac that all his severance agreements, including his $15 million golden parachute, would be honored, and that he, Perelman, would want Bergerac to stay on as chief executive. One associate of Bergerac recalls Bergerac remarking angrily, shortly after the Perelman encounter, "Can you imagine this guy, saying he's going to make me a rich man?" Lawyer Arthur Lehman, whose firm, Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton and Garrison, had been counsel to Revlon for decades, had also worked for Perelman in recent years, and he had arranged this encounter. Ronald was sensitive to Bergerac's position as the CEO, and he really wanted to please, but he went about it in the worst possible way, Lehman said. Perelman said that he and Bergerac had a very cordial meeting, lasting about an hour and a half, and that Bergerac suggested that they make a dinner date to discuss the transaction further. Then, Perelman said, Bergerac cancelled the dinner, saying it would be pointless to meet because he was not going to do the deal. Perelman denied that he offered Bergerac extra inducements. "I never even mentioned or hinted or winked about his getting anything." Associates of both men agree that their personal styles must have blended like oil and water. Bergerac is a courtly, somewhat imperious, urbane, witty Frenchman. Perelman is crude, brusque, humorless, speaks in a staccato manner and perpetually puffs an enormous cigar. "They didn't hit it off," declared Perelman's lawyer and constant cohort, Donald Drapkin, who was at Skadden, Arps, Slate, Mar and Flom. Bergerac with his Chateau Lafite, and Ronnie with his Diet Coke. And I think that after that meeting Bergerac checked with his friends, and most of them had never heard of Ron Perelman. Or if they had, they said he was young, really aggressive, and Jewish. I think it was just beneath him. Bergerac had long inhabited the corporate stratosphere. In the 1960s, when Harold Janine was building International Telephone and Telegraph (ITT) into the world's biggest conglomerate, Bergerac helped negotiate about 100 acquisitions of companies for ITT in Europe, and in 1971, at the age of 39, Bergerac was promoted to the job of running all ITT European operations. During the next 3 years, he doubled European sales to $5 billion. But in 1974, Bergerac, considered the most likely candidate to follow Janine as head of ITT, was wooed away by Charles Revson, the legendary founder of Revlon. Revson had courted Bergerac for several years, and when he finally won him, Bergerac received what was then an unprecedented bonus, $1.50 million. For a time, the financial press referred to Bergerac as Cadif-Ishish, after the Yankees pitcher Cadif-Ishish Hunter, who also won a 7 contract at that time. In 1978, Bergerac was the subject of an admiring cover story in Time magazine, which noted that the company had survived, triumphantly, the death of its founder, Revson, and that in 4 years, since Bergerac had taken over, sales and Professor ITS had multiplied about 2.5 times, twice as fast as the industry average. In the last several years, however, Bergerac had lost some of his star quality. The company's earnings reached a peak of $192 million in 1980, dropped to $111 million in 1982, and essentially stayed at that level through 1984, though in the first half of 1985, just as Perelman was approaching, they began to rise by about 10%. The weakness was in the cosmetics business. When demand slackened in the early 1980s and competition intensified, Revlon lost market share and Professor ITS. Meanwhile, however, Bergerac had vastly expanded Revlon's healthcare business, making 11 acquisitions and increasing revenues tenfold in the past decade. With its stock in 1984 trading in the mid-30s, considerably below its breakup value, Revlon had attracted the attention of some investors known as the Freites Group, after their leader, Joseph Freites, a wealthy Oklahoma investor, who went to Milken to explore financing. According to one member of that group, secret talks were held with Bergerac, who was not opposed to the idea of a buyout in which he would continue to run the company and would own 10 to 15%. Bergerac asked repeatedly whether the financing was in place, and was assured that it was. But when the group was ready to go public with their proposal and made their formal approach in a meeting at Arthur Lehman's ICE in the spring of 1984, Lehman determined, in a call to Milken, that their financing negotiations were in the most preliminary stage. Bergerac, furious, sent them packing with a cursory public denunciation, referring to them as the gin rummy gang, saying their only money came from the kitty for their card games in Southampton. But in the acquisition-happy marketplace of 1984, once the Freites Group had made their approach, the company was in play. That summer, Alan Clore, the English investor who had climbed on the Icon bandwagon in Marshall Field, acquired stock. Realizing his vulnerability, Bergerac explored with his investment banker, Peter Jacquith of Lazard Frères, the viability of his leading a management-leveraged buyout, but they concluded that the price that would make the deal workable, in the low 40s, would not pass muster with the board. And then, for about 6 months, the rumors quieted, and Bergerac did nothing to pursue his own buyout. In the spring of 1985, however, Perelman had extended his feelers. Drapkin enlisted the help of Joseph Flom, senior partner of Skadden, Arps. Flom talked to Felix Rahotin, senior partner of Lazard Frères, about Perelman's interest in Revlon. Rahotin said later that Flom was talking about a leveraged buyout with management, and that he responded that for Lazard to render a fairness opinion the price would have to be in the mid-50s. Simon Rifkind, founder of Paul, Weiss, and, at 84, a luminary in the bar, dipped his oar into these waters. Rifkind had been on the Revlon board since the late FIFTIES and was executor of the Revson estate. He had also been counsel to the family of Perelman's Phi Rst wife, Faith Golding Perelman, for generations, and had become a director on the board of McAndrews and Forbes. Now, just before the June meeting, he spoke to Bergerac on behalf of Perelman, describing him as a kind of young Larry Tisch. Arthur Lehman, Rifkin's protégé and heir apparent in the Paul, Weiss Phi said Perelman came to have lunch with him and talked about how Revlon was bound to be sold in any case, and he would do well by the shareholders and well by Bergerac. He said he really needed Michel because he was a wonderful operator and he, Perelman, was not an operating person. Lehman also recalled that Flom told him that Perelman had never done a hostile deal, with the clear implication to me, Lehman added, that he would not. Perelman felt like a welcome suitor. The signals we were getting in May and June were all positive, he asserted. We were hearing back from Felix and Arthur things like, the price, has to start with a 5A, but it could end with a 0, and, we like the music we're hearing. But all this high-powered matchmaking back I read when Bergerac met Perelman in mid-June and the reality of Ronald Perelman in Pantry Pride and Perelman's banker, Drexel, making it all possible via the sale of junk bonds hit home with Bergerac. Bergerac didn't know much about Drexel before Perelman's visit, but he quickly learned. Michael Milken is very clever, Bergerac declared. He has done the same thing that Delphi Neto, who was finance minister of Brazil, did there. No one would lend Brazil money, so Delphi Neto said to the bankers, "What does it cost? I will pay whatever it takes." Well, Milken realized people would do the same thing, all these people whom the banks would never lend to in a million years, and Milken says, "Here's 100 million. And they say, "Wonderful." In the old days, people to whom the banks would not lend went to pawnbrokers, who charged an arm and a leg. Now Drexel has inserted itself between the pawnbrokers and the banks. As Bergerac's comments suggest, Revlon was indeed a class war, between the corporate America and Wall Street elite, and the Drexel Arrivistas. It was not simply a turf battle, to be sure. Most of the defenders of Revlon in this FI-GHT genuinely deplored the junk bond depredations as financial free-for-alls hurtling toward disaster, and they believed, moreover, that these high-risk players were violating the law to achieve their goals. But beneath these complaints of principle lay something more visceral. The age-old hatred for the outsider, always exacerbated when that undesirable other dares to venture beyond his conference INES and encroach upon the elite's preserve. Certainly those in Perelman's camp perceived the violent opposition they encountered as generated by class bias. Howard Gittes, a well-connected Philadelphia lawyer who left his law firm to join Perelman shortly before the Revlon battle, recalled Perelman's early overtures. At the beginning, we really believed that we would be able to do it friendly. There was a lot of suggestion that, especially with his huge parachute in place, this was a chief executive who would not kick and scream. But I'm convinced that Bergerac's was a non-economic, emotional reaction. He didn't want Revlon to be sold to Panty Pride, as he called it, and then Marty Lipton, of the law firm of Wachtel, Lipton, Rosen and Katz, and Felix Rahotin, fanned that feeling of Bergerac's. Their attitude was, who are these people, coming in to buy a company like Revlon? They're upstarts that nobody ever heard of, and they're financed by Drexel, an upstart itself. Perelman is one of the great stories of coming from nowhere in the last decade, commented one of his associates admiringly in early 1986. 7 or 8 years ago, when I met him, he didn't even have a business. Today he's worth maybe $500 million. Indeed, Perelman's life story reads like a parable of these leveraged times. He grew up in comfortable circumstances in Philadelphia, where his father, Raymond Perelman, owned a small metal fabricating firm, Belmont Industries. Ronald Perelman graduated from the University of Pennsylvania and then from the Wharton School, receiving an MBA in 1966. His marriage to Faith Golding, whose grandfather had founded the Sterling National Bank and the Essex House Hotel in New York and had amassed a fortune, obviously pleased Perelman's parents. In an interview in 1986, several years after Ronald Perelman had divorced Golding and married gossip columnist Claudia Cohen, Raymond Perelman ticked off the real estate holdings of the Golding family and pointed out on the baby grand piano the numerous photographs of Faith, including her bridal photo, noting rather acidly, "He's divorced, we're not." For the next 12 years, Perelman worked in his father's business and managed his wife's money. Then, in 1978, at age 35, he decided to venture out. He borrowed $1.90 million to buy 34% of Cohen Hatif Ield Industries, a jewelry distributor and retailer with $49 million in revenues that year. In 1980, Cohen Hatif Ield spent about $45 million to buy McAndrews and Forbes, a maker of chocolates and licorice extracts, and the Cohen Hatif Ield name was dropped in favor of McAndrews. In the fall of 1980, McAndrews issued its Phi RST batch of junk bonds, a modest $33 million, underwritten by Drexel with Bear Stearns. Over the next 4.5 years, Perelman set out on a wholly leveraged, though relatively small-time, acquisition trail. He tried and failed to acquire the Richardson Company and the Milton Bradley Toy and Game Company, but he made money in both transactions. He succeeded in buying, for a total of about $360 million, Technicolor, Inc., the Phi LM processor. Video Corporation of America, a major manufacturer of home video cassettes. The Phi LM processing assets of Movie Labs, Consolidated Cigar, and a controlling interest in Pantry Pride. Roughly $140 million of this money came from Drexel junk bond offerings, the rest from banks, and all built on that original, borrowed, $1.90 million, back in 1978. Perelman chose companies that were strong cash flow generators and that had problem assets that could be sold off, quickly paying down much of the high-interest debt, leaving the pared-down, Professor I table core business. Before Revlon, Perelman's greatest acquisition success story was Technicolor, the Phi LM processing company which he bought in early 1983 for about $105 million, and an additional $20 million of assumed debt. Technicolor was a dominant force in the Phi LM processing industry, but it had made an unsuccessful diversify cation effort into a chain of one-hour photo processing stores. Its stock had plummeted from $28 per share in the second quarter of 1981 to $8 to $10 per share in the second quarter of 1982. Perelman's price, $23 per share, looked rich. He sold off the processing stores and 4 other divisions for about $30 million, plus notes, receivables and warrants with a value of more than $20 million, as well as some of its California real estate for about $6.40 million, reducing his debt substantially. In 1983, Technicolor's earnings skyrocketed, and within 2 years the company had paid for itself. Declares Drapkin, Perelman's close friend and advisor, Technicolor was the classic Perelman transaction. He paid full price for the company, seeing values no one else saw, sold off pieces and put money back into the core business, and earnings have gone up dramatically. But if allegations in a suit Phi led in the Delaware Chancery Court against Perelman, Technicolor, its previous directors and McAndrews and Forbes are found to have merit. Perelman may yet have to pay substantial damages, and his greatest success story pre-Revlon will have a rather smarmy postscript. The complaint, led by Cinerama, which was a stockholder of Technicolor, started out as an appraisal action, claiming that Perelman had not paid a fair price for Technicolor, and then, because of facts learned in discovery, was amended in January 1986 to include claims of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. According to the complaint, in September 1982 a banker from Bear Stearns asked Fred Sullivan, the early Icon investor and a Technicolor director, to meet with Perelman to discuss Technicolor. Sullivan agreed. A meeting was scheduled in 1 week's time, and before the meeting Sullivan purchased 1,000 shares of Technicolor stock at about $9.50 a share. As a result of a subsequent insider trading investigation by the SEC, Sullivan agreed to disgorge all Professor ITS made by that stock purchase. Sullivan then met with Perelman and became his ombudsman. He arranged for Perelman to meet the Technicolor chairman, Morton Kamerman, and, it is alleged, was the only Technicolor director from whom Kamerman sought advice. The complaint also alleges that Sullivan was retained by Perelman to lobby for the transaction, in return for a fee of $150,000. None of the other directors, it is alleged, knew that Sullivan, who was voting for the transaction, was retained to do so. The complaint alleges that Perelman sweetened the deal for Technicolor's chairman, Kamerman, by granting an enhancement of his employment contract and a structure for the transaction which would allow Kamerman to receive the best tax treatment for the sale of certain option shares of Technicolor he owned. It further alleges that these sweeteners were negotiated, and the price of $22 to $23 per share was agreed on, before Kamerman consulted with any disinterested member of the board or with Goldman Sachs, which later rendered the fairness opinion. Kamerman, however, testified that he did not solicit Perelman's approval of the amendment which was passed by the board. Furthermore, the complaint charges that a director named Arthur Ryan, who was then president and chief operating officer ICER and has since become chairman of Technicolor, was induced to vote for the transaction by the private promise, told to no other director, that if he did so he would be granted the opportunity to run the company. Ryan, a former Paramount Pictures Corporation executive who had a bitter running feud with Kamerman, it is alleged, was being kept apprised of the deal's progress by Martin Davis, then a senior executive of Gulf Plus Western who would later become its chairman. Davis is a friend of Perelman and had been Ryan's boss at Paramount, a division of Gulf Plus Western. Davis allegedly told Perelman that Ryan would be crucial to the company's success, and then relayed the message to Ryan that, under Perelman's aegis, he would manage the company. Within little more than a month after the transaction, Perelman terminated Kamerman and, as he had allegedly promised, made Ryan chairman. Both Perelman and Ryan have denied in depositions that any promises were made. Taken as a whole, the complaint paints a picture in which Perelman allegedly used deceit and secret deals, money here, position there, whatever it took, to buy off the necessary people and get the company. In early 1983, with Technicolor under his belt, Perelman began to move to take McAndrews and Forbes private. According to close associates, he was influenced by two factors. The first was that his marriage to Faith Golding was ending in what he knew would be a very messy, publicized divorce, and he did not want the added glare of a public company's spotlight upon him. Perelman had had an affair, as his wife's detectives had been able to document. Moreover, his wife would allege, as part of her divorce action, that he had misused money that came from her family, and she would claim in a filing with the SEC that she owned part of her husband's claimed 1/3 interest in McAndrews. In his divorce, Perelman was represented by his longtime friend Roy Cohn. Cohn told the Wall Street Journal that the Perelman divorce settlement talks almost broke down at the last minute because Perelman disputed 1/8 of a percentage point of interest that he was to pay his ex-wife. But the action was settled in 1983, with terms that included Perelman's paying Golding $3.80 million in cash. The other reason Perelman wanted to take McAndrews and Forbes private, one associate said, was that he wanted to do some things which might be criticized in a public company, have his own plane, have his artwork in his ICE. He wanted to have McAndrews and Forbes as his nest egg, and then he wanted to acquire some other public company for presenting his face to the financial world. In March 1984, Perelman took the company private, with Drexel raising the $95 million that the deal required. Then, the next fall, he became enamored of the huge tax loss carry-forward, or net operating loss, in Pantry Pride. He reasoned that this knoll not only could be put to good use in sheltering the income of any company he might acquire, but would give him a substantial advantage in a bidding war. Post-bankrupt situations, moreover, were a specialty of Milken, who had made much of his fortune analyzing the securities of bankrupt companies. And by this time, in the fall of 1984, Perelman was being positioned as one of the Drexel players, along with Icahn and Peltz and William Farley, all of them being provided their war chests. Drexel investment banker Paul Abecassis, who started working on Perelman financings in the early 80s, said Perelman was a logical choice. Ronnie in his own little way was already doing it. He was acquisition-oriented, using leverage to go after companies and then using the cash out to pay down the debt. Also, his personality was right. He was extremely ambitious, willing to take risks. It was a natural. There were obstacles, however, between Perelman and Pantry Pride. The idea had been brought to Perelman in late '84 by Patrick Rooney, a co-founder of the brokerage house of Rooney, Pace Group Inc., since closed down, which specialized in initial public offerings of small, risky companies, and which had one of the worst reputations on Wall Street. It also had a close relationship with Drexel. In the summer of 1984, Rooney, Pace had done a $25 million junk bond offering, at an interest rate of nearly 18%, which according to the prospectus was underwritten by Rooney, Pace but which in fact was placed by Milken. One associate of Patrick Rooney said that Milken thus extended himself because the plan was to have Rooney, Pace pick up the smaller or riskier junk business. A buyer of the Rooney, Pace paper also conference IRMED that it was sold by Milken. In late '84, Rooney was about to wage a proxy FI GHT for Pantry Pride. According to one insider, Perelman did not want to join Rooney in that FI GHT for fear that he would be tarred by the Rooney, Pace brush. According to another associate, Perelman also felt that, given the allegations made by his former wife during their divorce, he would suffer in the mudslinging of a proxy contest. And his FI null problem with joining Rooney was that Drexel was representing Pantry Pride. We made Ronnie sit on the sidelines, because we didn't want one client going after another, said investment banker Stephen Weinroth of Drexel, describing the policy that would be invoked less than 6 months later when Icahn went after Twa. In Perelman's stead, Philadelphia lawyer Howard Gittes joined the Rooney team, though Gittes claims he was acting independently. Perelman continued to hold a large block of stock. Then, when Gittes and Rooney lost the proxy vote in early 1985, Perelman stepped in. And with the advent of Perelman, Grant Gentry, the chairman of Pantry Pride, who had fought bitterly during the proxy FI GHT, became malleable. With Drexel representing both sides in the negotiations, McAndrews and Forbes acquired control of 37.6% of Pantry Pride, for $60 million. And Gentry received a payment, some of which was structured to be paid out over his lifetime, of about $3 million with additional payments of $150,000 for the rest of his life, in lieu of a pension. Now, having had his way with Technicolor and with Pantry Pride, Perelman moved on to Revlon. In the junk bond takeover war, which began in earnest in early 1985 with Icon's raid on Philips, Revlon was the crucial campaign. That was where the most impassioned corporate defenders were united against Milken's onslaught, where they unloaded everything in the takeover defense arsenal, and where they fought down to the wire, committed to evading Perelman at all costs to the very last moment. What they lost sight of, particularly as Perelman, by the good grace of Milken, kept upping his all-cash bid, was that Perelman's money was as good for the shareholders as anyone else's. In the end, they sought so desperately to escape his clutches that they undid themselves. To Bergerac and his advisors, and to the rest of the corporate establishment that watched with fear and trembling, the FIGHT for Revlon was a rude introduction to a new world. All the brainpower, clout and class connections that Revlon summoned were no match for the raw financial might of Drexel. Michael Milken had become the great equalizer. At the outset, it seemed to Revlon's advisors, and to much of Wall Street, preposterous that Pantry Pride would prevail. For all the furor in Congress over Drexel and its junk bond financed takeovers, the facts were that by mid-1985 few had succeeded. In the most highly visible and emotion-charged bids, Icons for Philips and Pickens for Unical, the companies had fended off the raiders. Triangle's bid for National Can had succeeded, but that had not exactly started out hostile. National Can was in the midst of trying to do its own LBO.